Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 5. The course was Prime Directive, Theories and Application. It was one of the basic courses that all cadets had to master, filled with various case studies and scenarios that often led to lively, even bitter debates among students. The Prime Directive was the first law of Starfleet. It stated that interference in the affairs and development of other planets and civilizations was forbidden, and it was a foundation upon which all other aspects of space exploration was based. It was also Worf's first class. When he entered the classroom, there was a general buzzing as the cadets talked with one another. You saw in their expressions everything from extreme nervousness to utter confidence. The lecture hall angled downward, and stairways at either side led down to the lectern. Many of the seats farther back were already occupied, as students followed the age-old custom of trying to sit as far back in the room as possible. There, they figured, the teacher would not be able to see them. The strategy never worked, but it didn't stop students from trying it anyway. As a result, Worf had to cover quite a bit of distance before he got to a row where there was an unoccupied seat, and he could not help but notice that as he passed each row of students, the talking and buzzing ceased, to be replaced by hushed whispering. Worf did not even glance at them, but he knew they were talking about him. Then he did allow himself to look, and yes, indeed, they were stealing peeks at him. It was one of those situations where people desperately wanted to look, but they didn't want to be caught looking. As a result, they made a tremendous show of trying to be subtle, but wound up being more obvious than ever. Tanya Tobias was seated about halfway down, and she waved to Worf. During the brief time he'd known her, Worf had been impressed by her genuine friendliness toward him. Naturally, being who he was also suspicious. There were no empty seats in her row, though, so sitting next to her wasn't an option. He kept going. He caught sight of Simon, who was seated midway across the third row from the front. Simon gestured for him to come over and sit beside him. For a moment, Worf considered the option of distancing himself from his brother. Worf was clearly considered an oddity. Why ruin Simon's reputation as well? But Simon was insistent, and the inevitable feeling of isolation got the better of Worf. He slid into place next to his brother. "They're staring at me," Worf murmured in a low voice. Simon shrugged. "Possibly. So what? He'll always be stared at, Worf. From now on, it's out of curiosity. Eventually, it'll be out of admiration." He smiled that easy smile of his and punched Worf affectionately on the shoulder. "You old guy." The far door opened and the professor emerged. He bore a striking resemblance to an owl. From the beakish nose and tufts of white hair to the general slumped posture, this was Professor Lynch, and his reputation was legendary. Lynch approached the lectern, turned, and regarded the class with a glare so piercing that it could have knocked down deflector shields. There was no whispering now. Indeed, the only sound to be heard throughout the class was a series of nervous swallows. Worf was impassive, however. Deep down, he was already convinced that he was not going to make it through the academy. And there were too many factors against him. It did not mean that he wasn't going to try his best, but on the other hand, he wasn't going to be too surprised if it was ultimately decided that Starfleet wasn't ready for its first Klingon, and he would graciously accept failure when it came to him. After all, the Klingon Federation Alliance had a long and tortured history since the Khitomer Conference of 2293. Every time a step forward had been taken, it seemed to be quickly followed by 2 steps back. It was barely a dozen years since the noble sacrifice of the Enterprise NCC-1701C, which had been destroyed valiantly defending a Klingon outpost on Narendra 3 from a Romulan attack. That brave act had been the turning point of Klingon Federation relations, but it was recent enough history that Klingons were still viewed askance by Terrans with short tempers and long memories. Terrans and Brickar. Worf glanced around, but he didn't see Zach anywhere. He must be taking the class at another time. For that, Worf was grateful. Professor Lynch had a pad in front of him that he consulted to check the students' names. "In all my first-year classes, at this time," said Lynch, "I say the following words to my students. Listen carefully. These words will carry you through the difficult days and the long nights ahead. These words will serve you as you attempt to learn how to serve Starfleet. These words will give you strength as you watch, one by one, other classmates spiral down in flames, as you watch their hopes and dreams dashed by the demanding, rigorous, and sometimes overwhelming requirements of Starfleet Academy. And these words are, good luck. You'll need it." And then, without further preamble, he said, "Let us now examine the case of a Mini R7. He glanced at his pad, Mr. Rozhenko." Worf and Simon both started to rise and looked at each other. If Lynch was surprised, he didn't show it. Twins, I assume." A mild ripple of laughter drifted through the hall. "Sir," Worf quickly said, "a request, if I may." Lynch inclined his head slightly, indicating that Worf should continue. "Among my people, the first name is used in all forms of direct address, including after honorifics such as Mr. The house name or surname is reserved for formal occasions. To avoid confusion, I should be addressed as Mr. Worf." "Very well." Lynch tapped a notation into his pad, and immediately the request was updated on similar devices held by all the other teachers throughout the academy. "Now, Mr. Worf, I was speaking to Mr. Rozhenko." Again, there was laughter. Clearly, the students were in a good mood whenever there was amusement to be had at Worf's expense. Worf sat, and Simon remained standing. "Mini R7, said Lynch again. Simon said nothing. Puzzled, Worf looked up. Simon's usual ready smile was still there, but it was frozen on his face with no sincerity behind it. "Mr. Rozhenko," said Lynch more loudly, even more forcefully, "we are waiting. In Mini R7, if you please." This was a signed reading before you came to class. Did you read the case, Mr. Rozhenko? Simon's mouth moved, but no sound came out, and then he managed to find his voice. "Yes, sir. I read the text. There were just so many case studies. I don't have that one at my fingertips." Lynch came around from behind the lectern, his fingers resting lightly on it. "If you were in a life-and-death situation, Mr. Rozhenko, and you need Starfleet precedent to tell you what to do you think that you will be able to bring matters to a halt while you scan through your texts for the correct answer? Starfleet is not a court of law, Mr. Rozhenko. You will not be allowed the leisurely study of cases to prepare a brief. You must know things instantly, or it can cost you or your crew your life. Is that clear?" Simon was sweating. His fingers wrapped so tightly around the edges of his desk that his knuckles were turning white. And Worf, as softly as he possibly could, whispered, "Kirk!" "Kirk!" Simon fairly shouted, and then the words practically bubbled out of him. "The Enterprise went to a Mini R7 on a diplomatic mission. Mini R was engaged in a computer-simulated war with their neighboring world, Vendikar. Computer-generated casualties were turned into real casualties through the voluntary suicide of the citizens upon being designated as fatalities." Lynch nodded approvingly. "And what happened?" "The Enterprise was registered as a casualty. Rather than submit his crew to be killed, Captain Kirk destroyed the computers of Mini R7, effectively ending the war. And he was wrong to do so, wasn't he?" It stopped Simon cold. "Sir?" "Check the case, Mr. Rozhenko," said Lynch. Mini R tried to warn off the Enterprise. They issued a Code 710 forbidding contact. Kirk ignored it, an infraction of the Prime Directive right there. His violation resulted in the theoretical demise of his ship and crew, and then he destroyed Mini R's entire way of life, an even more flagrant Prime Directive breach. Is that what you would have done?" No, sir," said Simon quickly, taking his cue from the scowling demeanor of his teacher. His response prompted an incredulous gasp from Lynch. What? You would have ordered your crew to die then? To voluntarily walk into disintegration chambers? What kind of cold-hearted commander would you have been? They might have mutinied. Did you consider that as you were shuffling them off to their deaths? No, I mean, yes. Worf was stunned. He'd never seen Simon this flustered. Or flustered at all, as a matter of fact. Without thinking, he was on his feet.
Captain Kirk's actions were necessary, sir. Not right nor wrong. Necessary.
I was not speaking to you, Mr. Worf, said Lynch.
No, sir, but I was speaking to you, sir.
There was a faint intake of breath from several of the cadets. Worf's response was perilously close to insubordination, but he had kept his voice as neutral, even respectful, as he possibly could. Lynch's face darkened in a fierce scowl, and then he looked into the young Klingon's face, and in that brief moment, even saw a little into his heart, and what he saw was a young male filled with respect for his teacher and loyalty to his brother and absolutely no fear for himself. It was an impressive combination. The professor managed to keep some degree of that stern expression on his face. Captain Kirk did have a choice.
No, sir, he did not, because one of the two choices would have been tantamount to murdering his crew. No Starfleet officer, no man, if he is to call himself a man, would have made that dishonorable decision. That left him with one choice, and one choice, sir, is no choice.
Lynch was silent for a long moment, and then he said, Speak out of turn again, Mr. Worf, and it will be reflected in your grades. Take your seat, both of you. They did so. Let us examine moment by moment the Miniar 7 scenario, said Lynch, and see where a potential disaster might have been averted. Mr. Del Vecchio, he said, addressing Cadet Anita Del Vecchio as Mr., in accordance with Starfleet tradition. We'll begin with you.
I know why you did that,
said Worf. Simon had exited the classroom quickly, but Worf caught up with him. They strode down the hallway together.
You couldn't fool me, Simon.
Oh, no? Simon now looked utterly composed.
No. I know why you froze in class. You were trying to build up my own confidence. Those questions were easy, but you let yourself be thrown so that I could come to your rescue.
Simon smiled wanly. Was I that obvious?
To me, yes. It was very noble, and exactly what I might have expected from you.
Simon clapped Worf on the back. It was no problem. Worf nodded in acknowledgement. Rarely did he smile, and headed off to his quarters. The moment he was gone, Simon's smile faded, and he sagged against the wall, shuddering. Chapter 6. None of the group had been quite able to believe it. The legend of Mark McHenry had grown swiftly from the first time he'd opened his mouth in basic navigation class. The instructor had thought she had found easy pickings in McHenry. The rest of the class had sat at rigid attention, trying, with only limited success, to grasp the fundamentals of astronavigation. Mark McHenry had looked as if he were somewhere else entirely. He sat there staring at the overhead lighting as if it had sprouted wings. The instructor was certain that McHenry was not paying the least bit of attention. She began to recite a long, complex problem that sent the entire class scrambling to their calculators. They tried desperately to keep up as she threw in variable after variable, stray neutrinos, a quasar, a possible wormhole, all manner of deep space phenomena that had to be accounted for when laying in the course. And as their fingers flew over the pads, McHenry just sat there with his chin in his hands, as if he were trying to watch passing electrons. And so, the instructor concluded, you must reach your destination in precisely 3 days, 19 hours, and 42 minutes. What warp factor to the 1,000th place must be maintained? Mr. McHenry, she crowed triumphantly. And without so much as a split-second pause, Mark replied, Warp 4.735926. The instructor's jaw dropped. Students using their data pads took at least another 10 seconds to get the answer that Mark McHenry had just uttered off the top of his head. As if noticing the teacher for the first time, Mark looked straight at her. I'm sorry, he said, genuinely apologetic. You did say thousandths, just warp 4.736 then. I'm assuming you wanted that rounded off. She nodded slowly, double-checking her own calculations with amazement. Mr. McHenry, how in the world did you just do that? Do what? He asked in genuine confusion. Rumor had it that the instructor had later pored over McHenry's files, convinced that he wasn't human. She was overheard muttering to another teacher, I haven't felt that overmatched since that gold-faced android was a student here a dozen years ago. Days had passed since that event. Mark continued to appear oblivious to the humor and unique aspect of his classroom performance. It had even taken his study group mates quite some time to fully grasp the way that the mind of Mark McHenry worked. There were plenty of subjects at which Mark was only adequate at best. He had no head for deep philosophical discussions because he had trouble concentrating on them. Physically, he was not particularly impressive, and the self-defense classes were nothing short of disastrous. He had a basic grasp of engineering, but that was about all. But when it came to the realm of helm and navigation, it would have been an understatement to say that it was easy for him. In fact, it was too easy. Mark could plot courses and steer vessels with a speed that was matched only by computer, and computers didn't have human intuition to supplement them. Because it came easily to him, he simply did not devote a sizable portion of his brain or attention to it. So he would daydream or speculate or work on coming to a fuller understanding of something that had previously eluded him. When instructors saw him in that state, they had first been under the impression that he was unaware of anything going on around him. They didn't realize that he was as aware as anyone else in the class, if not more so. It was quality of attention, not quantity, that was at issue. And when it came to quality, no one was able to approach Mark McHenry. Now Mark was reclining in his favorite chair in his quarters, working with the rest of the study group as they labored over reviewing the week's lessons. If there was any frustration in dealing with Mark, it was that he had real difficulty explaining how he did what he did. He simply did it. Analyzing it was something that he was not very experienced with. They'd been at it for 3 solid hours. Finally, Simon leaned back and shut off his pad. My head is swimming, he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. Mark looked up, interested. Really? I would think they'd tend more to float, actually, since they don't have arms to swim. Well, in fact, they'd probably sink rather than float, wouldn't they? Salida, Worf, and Tanya looked at him. Simon, who had long since gotten used to it, just leaned his head back. Worf rose and said briskly, I'll be going then. And without another word, walked out of the room. That was abrupt, said Tanya. Typical, said Salida, still looking over some text. Klingons are an extremely moody species. Unfortunately, the moods range from bad to irritable. Be nice, Simon told her. Salida looked at him with eyebrow askance. That is meant to be humorous, yes? Now Tanya headed for the door. Salida, who was her roommate, called after her. Will you be out late tonight? I plan to meditate, and we'll have the door sealed from 2100 to 2130 hours. You'll certainly have your life mapped out, don't you? Said Simon. That's pretty amazing. Salida gave a small shrug. To me, what is amazing is that anyone would not have his or her life mapped out. Don't worry, Salida, Tanya said. I won't disturb you. I have plans too. She walked out into the hallway, and then, once the door closed behind her, murmured to herself, Now, if only I knew what they were. But she knew even as she said it. She knew before she started down the hallway that she was going to Worf's quarters, that she just wanted to talk to him. She nodded politely to other classmates as she walked past them, but never strayed from the course that was going to lead her straight to Worf's quarters. Soon she slowed, though, because she wasn't precisely sure which room was Worf's. But then she got a clue that tipped her off right away. It was the sound of raised voices. One of them she immediately recognized as Worf's. The other she shortly identified as belonging to the Brickar cadet Zach Kebron. The voices were slightly muffled, but only slightly, indicating that they were coming from inside a room. Tanya noticed that the shouting match was drawing no reaction whatsoever from other passers-by. She realized immediately that this was apparently so common in this particular area, the cadets had gotten used to it. When are you going to get it through your oversized skull? Zach demanded. You're simply not welcome here.
I have every right to be here,
Worf retorted. Rights. We're not talking rights. We're talking history. And historically, no one has ever trusted a Klingon. It is remarkable to me that you're vain enough to think you single-handedly can change that.
No more vain than for you to think that you single-handedly can drive me from the Academy.
Oh, I don't think that, Klingon. You've already made it painfully clear that no matter what anyone says, you're going to continue to force your unwanted presence on us. Isn't that right? By this point, Tanya had found the room where the yelling was coming from. She stopped one passing student and asked, "Are they always like this?" "Oh, no," replied the student. "Sometimes they're really loud." Tanya whistled. The student went on his way, and she stood outside the door, debating whether to ring the chime. But then she heard harsh footsteps coming toward the door. Feeling like a spy for some reason, she stepped back and flattened herself against the wall so that she wouldn't immediately be spotted. The door hissed open, and Worf stormed out. His fists were clenched, his jaw set, his entire body was taut and quivering, and it was clear to Tanya that he was doing everything he could to rein himself in. He never even spotted her as he turned to the right and stalked off down the hallway. The sarcastic voice of Zach Keeburn called after him, "Don't hurry back on my account!" The door started to hiss shut, and Tanya was faced with three choices: follow Worf, enter the room, or go away and pretend that she hadn't been privy to any of the argument. Kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure book. Acting purely on impulse, she stepped into Worf and Zach's quarters. The door halted and it slid shut, retreated briefly so that she could enter, and then closed. From his desk, Zach Keeburn glanced up at her and frowned, his heavy face developing small ridges in it. "Tobias, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded. He pointed to the door. "If you're looking for your Klingon friend, you just missed him." She took a step forward. "Why do you hate him so much?" she demanded. Zach leaned back, regarding her with interest. "Now, why in the world should you care about that? It's none of your concern. He's my friend. He's in my study group. If something affects him, then it affects me." He made a low, somewhat amused-sounding cough. "Are you quite certain that's all it is?" "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, I've been watching you. How you always greet him so quickly, how you try to walk close to him without letting yourself be noticed. You like him, and you hate him. It's nothing personal. I hate all Klingons. What I can't comprehend is the sort of human that would become a Klingon friend." Tanya seemed to consider her response for a long moment. Then slowly she walked over to Zach and perched herself on the edge of his desk. "You ever heard of Khitomer?" she asked him. "Of course. The planet where they held the first major Klingon Federation peace conference, the first in a long line of meetings with the Klingons that inevitably resulted in broken promises and threats of war. And you know nothing of it beyond that?" "What's to know?" "Well, I wasn't thinking of the Khitomer Peace Conference of 2293. I was thinking of the attack on Khitomer over half a century later." "So there was an attack," said Zach. "So what?" She regarded him for a moment, as if debating whether to tell him or not. Clearly, though, having come this far, she could not go back. There was a Klingon outpost there, and Romulans attacked it. No one is sure why. The general speculation was that, in Romulan timekeeping, it represented some sort of anniversary of the peace conference. The Romulans and Klingons were allies once. "Never did any two races so royally deserve each other," said Zach. "And the breakup of that alliance was a very sore point between them. It caused many years of fighting. Anyway, the Romulans decided to make Khitomer a target, and they massacred the inhabitants. It was a sneak attack. 4,000 Klingons, Zach. 4,000 died in the slaughter. Men, women, children. Romulan plasma weapons didn't distinguish by age or gender." "As if the Klingons cared about their victims," said Zach. But he didn't say it with his usual bluster. As much as he disliked Klingons, the thought of such butchery was extremely distasteful. "My father," she continued, "was serving on board the starship Intrepid when they received a distress call. They got to the planet, but too late. The damage was done. Bloodied bodies everywhere, as far as the eye could see. It had been a science outpost, Keeburn. It was doing no harm to anyone. But that made no difference to the Romulans. They killed everyone they could anyway." She paused to let the image sink in. The Intrepid beamed down hundreds of crew members to help in the cleanup and to try and save lives wherever they could. My father had been on very few away teams. He was an engineer. But the captain pressed all able-bodied crew members to help out. He told me, so many times he told me, that he had never seen anything like it. And the thing that struck him the most was how brave the Klingons were. No moaning, no sobbing, no one begging. Help me, please. To all intents and purposes, they had been massacred, but nevertheless, as survivors, were unbowed. He told me about one Klingon woman. As soon as they pulled her out from under the rubble, she immediately pitched in digging out others. He didn't find out until later that she had a broken arm and 2 broken ribs. She just kept right on going, ignoring the pain. "Is there some point to all this?" said Zach, trying his best to sound impatient. As if he hadn't spoken, Tanya continued, "And there was one incident in particular that I remember. My father was passing by a pile of rubble, along with a fellow crew member, a warp field specialist named Sergei Rozhenko, and there was a little hand sticking out from under the debris. They figured that whoever the hand belonged to was dead, but then Rozhenko saw the hand move just a little bit, as if it were struggling with whatever small strength it had left to push the rubble off. Rozhenko ran over to the pile and shoved it off. My father helped him, and there, burned, battered, and newly made into an orphan, was a 6-year-old Klingon boy. He didn't utter a sound. There wasn't so much as a tear on his face. When Rozhenko asked where his parents were, he was able to lead them right to them. Well, to the half-ton of rubble, he thought their bodies were under at any rate. Finally, Rozhenko said to him, 'What's your name?' And the little Klingon boy said, 'Worf.' Now, Zach Kebron, compare your early life to that of young Worf Rozhenko. You talk of how your species has suffered, but what about you personally? And how does your suffering stack up next to what Worf went through?" Zach Kebron said nothing. Tanya slid off the desk and headed for the door. She stopped there, paused, and turned to face him. "Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do, Zach, but if I were you, I might consider easing up on Worf, just a bit. Because let's face it, if you think you're going to be able to hurt him, then you're kidding yourself. Compared to what he's lived through, anything that you could possibly throw at him would be minor league." And she walked out, leaving Zach Kebron alone with his study materials.